I'm going to show you how to use the Orchestrator REST API. Let's get started. Hi everyone, I'm Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place. In this video, we're going to take a look at the documentation for the Orchestrator REST API. Let's go take a look in the lab environment. To look at the documentation for the Orchestrator REST API, you're going to go to the Orchestrator server itself. I'm using the embedded Orchestrator server, so my Orchestrator server is my ARIA automation server, formerly known as vRise Automation. Anyways, you just start out with your usual FQDN, and then you add on to the tail end of that /VCO/API/docs, and that takes you to this page here. Now, the first thing that you'll notice when you go here is that it mentions something called Swagger. Swagger is a technology that provides a framework for developing REST APIs. It provides a number of features as you do so, including it will automatically generate documentation like the documentation we see here. The next thing I'd like you to notice is that it mentions something about a base URL. A key concept here is that you need to prepend this base URL onto all of the endpoint URLs that we're about to show you. All right, in the next section, it points out that the Orchestrator server's API is a REST API. If you don't know what REST is, you must not have watched all the videos preceding this. Anyways, I'm going to assume you know what REST is. In the next section, it talks about 3 different ways that you could potentially authenticate to your Orchestrator server. You could use LDAP, you could use vSphere single sign-on, or you could be using OAuth 2.0. I'm actually not using any of those. And the reason why is because I'm using the Orchestrator server that's embedded into ARIA automation. And as a result, my Orchestrator server isn't going to use these mechanisms to authenticate. Instead, my Orchestrator server is going to have ARIA automation do the authentication. So I don't have to learn about LDAP. I don't have to learn about single sign-on. I don't have to learn about OAuth 2 because everything's already set up for us. On the other hand, if you're using the standalone version of Orchestrator, reading this section of the documentation could be quite useful. But we're going to skip it. Instead, what we're going to do is go down to this next section here where it mentions something about data model, all endpoints act on a common data set, blah, 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 blah. But there's 2 things in this section that I want you to see. One is that the Orchestrator REST API will receive and allow you to send data formatted as JSON or data formatted as XML. Now, as I've been doing in numerous videos before this, I tend to use JSON. I used to use XML, but JSON, in my opinion, is much easier to work with. Unlike XML with all the punctuation and stuff that you got to get right, JSON is just easier to work with. But if you want to use XML or you need to use XML, XML is an available option in Orchestrator. Now, before we take a look at these endpoint URLs, why don't we pop over into Postman and let me show you how you can flip-flop back and forth between doing XML or JSON. So let's head over to Postman. All right, as you can see, I've got a bunch of different REST requests defined. As an example, let's take a look at Get One workflow. Now, when working with this REST request and all the other REST requests, you have a number of different headers that you can specify. There's 2 that we're interested in right now. One is the accept header, and the other is the content-type header. Now, content-type allows you to specify what data format you are going to use when you send data to the REST server. So when you send data in the request body to the Orchestrator server API, according to my content type setting, I'm going to be sending data in JSON format. And conversely, the accept header allows you to specify what format you want to receive back from the Orchestrator REST API. So content-type is the format of data that you're sending, and accept is the type of data that you want to receive back. Now, why don't we go ahead and run this request? So let me click send, and as you can see, so I checked my status code, I got a 200, that's good. And the data, as you can see here, is in JSON format, just like my header said I wanted. So if I was sending a body, that body, which I don't have here, but that body would need to be in JSON format. Why? Because I said content type is JSON. So content type, think of that in conjunction with the body tab, and accept header, think of that in conjunction with the response body that you get back. Now I'm going to flip this here real quickly, and why don't we say I want XML format to come back, and typically I'll do them both the same. Strictly speaking, you don't have to, but let's say we're going to send XML and we're going to receive XML. Again, we're not actually sending anything. My body's empty, but we are certainly going to get a response. Previously, we got our response back in JSON format, but let's take a look at what we get when we send this request now. Once again, I check my status code, and as you can see here, the response is in XML format. Right, so that was a quick little tangent. Let's go back to Orchestrator and talk about the endpoint URLs that are defined here. The endpoint URLs are divided up into different categories. Our first category is this one here called Deprecated. All the endpoint URLs that you see in the Deprecated section are valid endpoints to call, but we have deprecated them, meaning it is our plan to get rid of these particular endpoints. And in order to smooth the transition, you can still call these endpoint URLs now, but we are getting rid of these at some point. So in general, you don't want to call deprecated. It's certainly if you're developing a new REST client, you wouldn't want to start using the deprecated endpoints because, again, they're going away. So let's collapse that deprecated section. And as you can see, we have a number of other sections, including a whole bunch of them here. We've got this one called Access Token Controller Wrapper. We've got one called Action Controller, and the list goes on and on. So here's a whole bunch of endpoints. Here's some more endpoints. But in order to understand these endpoints, and when you first come into the Swagger documentation, it just shows you everything. I find for myself that I need to sort of drill down into the information. This is too much all at once for me. So you might want to do what I'm just about to do. We have all these different categories, such as Deprecated, Access Token Controller Wrapper, Action Controller, but it's too much for me, so I'm going to collapse each of these different categories. Okay, now we are looking at the same documentation, but we're just looking at the different categories of REST operations. Now, I'm going to jump down towards the bottom because if there's anything in this API that you probably want to know about first, it's these requests that you can make that have to do with workflows. So let's expand Workflow Controller, and we're going to take a quick look at some of what you can do. We're not going to talk about every single one of these. We'd be here all day long, but notice that if you want to, you can use this operation. So we use the get HTTP method. We use the endpoint URL /workflows. Remember, you need to prepin the base URL. For all of these, you prepin the base URL. And it tells us here what this operation is going to do. It's going to get us information about every single Orchestrator workflow. Now, obviously here, if we expand, we can see more information about that particular operation. So it tells you what it is, tells you what parameters it takes. Some of these parameters are generic. In other words, they apply to all of the different REST operations, and some of them are specific to the particular operation that you're looking at. Now, we're not going to go into a super duper deep dive here just yet, but these are the parameters. You can see the response codes that we expect to get. So you're either going to get a 200 and the data that you get back is going to be in this general format, or if you weren't authorized, you can get a 401. So it tells you here is what the operation is. Here's what its endpoint URL is. Here's the parameters that it takes, the query parameters. Here's the responses that we expect, and is quite useful. By the way, you can flip over here to JSON or XML to see this information in your preferred data format. We have lots of other operations here. For example, maybe you want to delete a workflow. Well, that one's a little bit different. You're going to use the delete HTTP method instead of get, and you're going to need to specify the workflow ID of the workflow that you want to delete. Now, we don't know how to look that up yet in the Orchestrator API, but you're going to learn how to do that as you go through these videos. What else can you do? You could create a new workflow. Again, here it's the same endpoint URL, but notice this time when we use the post HTTP method, it causes this same endpoint URL to behave in a different manner. So I'll let you, if you'd like here, hit pause and take a look at each of these, or better yet, go into your Orchestrator server, go into the documentation and start diving down into these. But try as you might, looking through this particular category, you're not going to find any operation that actually says to run a workflow. So what's going on here? If there's one thing I want to do through the Orchestrator REST API, it's I want to be able to kick off a workflow. So why isn't there anything here about running a workflow? Well, the answer is running a workflow falls under a different category. So we've been looking at the workflow-controller category, but let's go up top here, not that far, but right about, there it is, execution controller. So execution is another word for run, which is another word for invoke. So you might need to use different terminology to understand where to go, but this is where you need to go. So let's open up execution controller and take a look at what operations it provides. Well, let's jump straight to the one that you're perhaps most interested in. What if you want to run an Orchestrator workflow? Well, if you do a post/workflows, specify the workflow ID of the workflow that you want to run. Again, we're going to learn how to look that up that information, but just assume you know the workflow ID, or if you don't know how to do that in the REST API, you could always open up the Orchestrator client, go to the workflow you want to run, and on the summary page, you'll see the ID. But you do a post/workflows, specify the workflow ID/executions, and that will start an Orchestrator workflow running. And as you can see here, there's lots more that we can do. Again, we'll take a look at these as these videos unfold. But let's take a look at some of the other categories that I think are good places to start when you're first working with the Orchestrator REST API. Well, down towards the bottom, there's a category called User Interaction Controller. And that is the category that allows you to interact with what are called user interactions. If you're not familiar with user interactions in Orchestrator, they are essentially an approval type mechanism. They allow you to drag a user interaction schema element into your workflow, and when that schema element is encountered, the user interaction causes the workflow to pause, send a message to the approver or approvers to find out whether the workflow should proceed, or if it does proceed, should we change something about whatever request that the user has made. So that's the user interaction controller. Above there's something called resource controller. If you've ever worked with resources in Orchestrator, a resource in Orchestrator allows you to store a file so that you can have a file available not just to one workflow, but all the workflows could potentially use a resource file. In the Orchestrator client, if you go to Assets Resources, that's what these are for. And similarly, if we go up towards the top, where's it hiding? Configuration controller is related to configurations. Again, if you go into the Orchestrator client and go to Assets Configuration, those configurations that allow you to define variables and their values and have that information show up in whatever workflows that you want, those configurations can be looked up and modified and used through the Orchestrator REST API. Again, there, as you can see, a whole bunch more categories, each of which is full of lots and lots of different REST operations with detailed information about how you use each of them. But I wanted in this video to at least get you started at looking at this REST API documentation, because in order to use the Orchestrator REST API, you're going to have to come here at times to look up what you're trying to do. Join me in the next video as we continue to explore the Orchestrator REST API.